And it's up to you now, Kate.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so glad to see so many people have joined us today. I wanted to introduce Lunch and Learn is not part of MCMGA's. It's not our deal. It's not our program, but it is the Extension Office. And the Extension Office, of course, you know that Steve retired. And so Carrie Grable has been hired to take over as the extension educator. And I'm sure there's a fancier name, Carrie, so I apologize. But I wanted to turn this over to Carrie so that you all know that I won't be doing this in the future. I'll be attending, but Carrie will be the guy setting all of this stuff up. So Carrie, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction. And if I haven't spoken with you yet, I'm glad to meet everyone out there. Like Kate said, I am the new home horticulture educator for Marion County, and I'm sure we'll all get to know each other pretty soon. And I want to give Kate a big shout out because she did put this all together. She found the topic and the speaker, and she deserves all the credit. So thank you very much, Kate. And thank you for Paul for doing all of our technical support. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Barnes is the Exotic Forest Pest Educator with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. She received her doctorate in ecology from the University of Denver, where she specialized in plant-insect interactions and studied tent caterpillars and fall webworms. And she is currently working on science communication and invasive species outreach. So, Dr. Barnes, thank you very much for being here today, and I'll let you take it over.
Well, thank you for having me today. I normally talk to people about invasive species, and this year I get to talk to people about cicadas. So I'm excited to have a kind of a fun bug to tell you about today. I'm going to go through and tell you about cicada biology to start out with. The cicadas have a 17-year-long life cycle, most of which they spend underground, where they feed on tree roots. Now, they're not actually damaging the tree roots. They're just drinking basically the fluid in the roots. So they're not harming your trees very much at all when they're doing that. They emerge when the weather is around 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is typically in May or June, and after a warm rain. This year, we were expecting them a couple of weeks ago, and then the weather got cold, so the weather isn't really playing along with our plans and expectations for the cicadas, but hopefully they'll be out soon. When they do emerge, you can have up to 1.5 million cicadas per acre in some of the densest areas. So it's really kind of overwhelming and difficult to miss if you're in one of the hot spots. When they emerge, they crawl up out of the ground, they molt, and then climb into the trees, and the males will sing to find mates. People also describe it as screaming or this loud, overwhelming buzzing, but they're technically singing. They lay their eggs in the tree branches, and then those eggs will hatch in about 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the weather. They drop to the ground, and the cycle repeats all over again. They can be found throughout Indiana, but there is the highest population of cicadas in the South. That isn't to say there aren't some pockets in other parts of the state, but really the densest areas are going to be in southern Indiana. And this isn't how it used to be. So they used to be found really throughout the state in larger numbers, but largely because of land use changes over the years, we've seen declines in the population in some of the northern areas of the state. And this is because cicadas need trees constantly over that 17-year period. So if you remove the trees, you lose the cicadas. And then the cicadas don't travel very far underground. They're only going to go about a meter at the most, so not very far at all. And above ground, they're going 50 meters at the most. So they're not able to advance very far, and they're only able to repopulate an area about 50 meters from where they are every 17 years. So you can imagine that's going to be pretty slow. So even if you replant trees in an area, once you've lost them, it's going to take a long time to get the cicadas back. Now, in terms of when we're going to see them, this is a map of the soil temperature. I took a screenshot of it yesterday. And as you can see, it's about 58 in southern Indiana, 59 in some places. And in the rest of the state, it's really the mid 50s. Today is a little bit warmer. So this one I took the screenshot of midday yesterday, and it's already looking like this again this morning. So hopefully if it gets up into the 70s in the next week or two, that's when we'll start seeing the cicadas. And just as a note, I can share the link to where the rest of you can look at this map if it's something you're interested in. All right, now what can you expect once they actually start getting ready to emerge? Well, right now in a lot of places, the cicadas have tunneled up near the surface and they're kind of just hanging out underground in these burrows. You might notice these kind of perfectly round holes in the ground. You might see a bunch of them around your tree. The cicadas aren't emerged yet from those holes. They're just waiting, sort of, feeling how the temperature feels. And then once it's actually warm enough, they'll come out. You may also notice some of these mud chimneys, which you can see somebody's holding right over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but if you can, they're right over here. And these are little stacks of mud in the ground that the cicadas form. Once they do start emerging, you're probably going to see a lot of their exuvia, or their shed exoskeletons, all over your trees, all over posts, things like that. Even in normal years, we usually get 1 or 2 people who contact us and say, I don't know what this is. There's this weird bug that's been clinging onto my house. Like, what is it? Should I be worried? And don't worry, they're not alive anymore. This is just their skin. It's like a snake when it sheds its skin. But people get confused because when they molt, it's such a perfect replica of their body that they're leaving behind. You can see here, there's still the little hairs on the cicada. You can still see its little claws for digging. Everything is still there, including my favorite thing. I learned this back in high school, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. So now I have to tell everyone that I get to talk to about exuvia. Their lungs are actually part of their exoskeleton. And so if you see these little white strands kind of in the split area, those are actually the lungs of the cicada that they've shed. And you can see the same thing on dragonflies and other insects like that. Just look for that little white bit, and those are insect lungs. That's what they look like. During the day, they will also be pretty noisy. Luckily, they quiet down at night. They like to rest at night, just like the rest of us, but they will be quite noisy during the day. The sound, people have described it as anything from like standing next to a really loud lawnmower all the way to, a jet going by overhead. So somewhere in there where it's just this kind of overwhelming wall of sound. The cicadas, when they're doing that, are trying to sing to attract a mate. The males are the ones making the buzzing noise. The females respond by clicking their wings, which sounds a lot like snapping. So actually, if you snap, you can get the male cicadas to move up and down a branch. You can snap over towards your shoulder. And if there's a male cicada sitting right there, it might actually hop up on your shoulder if you're someone who wants to have a little cicada riding around for the day. And something kind of interesting that I also like to tell people about is how they're actually making this noise. So they don't use their lungs and voice box like we would to kind of shout and make noise. Instead, they have this organ on the side of their body called a timbal, which you can see here is kind of a membrane with these little folded bits. And then their abdomen, for the males anyways, is almost empty. So it's this big air chamber. So basically they contract the timbal, and then that resonates in the air chamber. And you can sort of think of it as some sort of bizarre hybrid of a bendy straw. When you bend it, it makes a noise. It's the same idea with the timbal. If you were to take that and like combine it with the body of a violin, that's sort of what the cicadas are doing when they're singing. Once they come out, there's also going to be this huge feeding frenzy. This is one of the really interesting things about cicadas, is that just any animal that can possibly eat insects is going to go wild and just stuff itself on cicadas. This has, a couple ripple effects throughout the environment. First off, the other bugs that they'd normally be eating, those get a little bit of a reprieve because the cicadas are just so much easier to catch. The second thing is that a lot of insect feeding animals will do a lot better this year. For example, birds who feed on insects, oftentimes we see that their chicks have a better survival rate during a cicada emergence year because they're able to get more food, and so none of the chicks go hungry. Downside of that is that mice and rats also will eat cicadas, so we will probably see more of those this year as well. But just to end on a high note, usually turkeys are fatter in the fall after a cicada emergence as well. So there's good and bad sides for us with this feeding frenzy. And then finally, once the cicadas die, their bodies fall to the ground and you have this big input of nutrients from their decaying bodies at kind of an odd time of year. So the plants get fertilized from the decaying cicadas. Now it's still kind of under investigation how much of an impact and how much of a boost this gives to trees, but definitely smaller plants get a little bit of a boost in their growth rate from the cicadas' bodies fertilizing them. Now, tree damage, which I'm sure a lot of you are quite worried about. The good news is most trees are safe. I know this picture may look kind of unnerving and scary to some of you, but if you look more closely, you'll notice that it's really only the very ends of the branches on this tree that have died off. It's just those little tips. So it's more like the cicadas are giving the trees kind of a pruning all the way around, rather than that they're actually doing serious damage that's going to harm your trees. So if your tree is a healthy, full-grown tree, it's probably going to be fine. It might be a little bit unsightly. And certainly if you want to have somebody come in and prune off those dead branches, you can do that. You can just leave it alone. You can do it yourself. But those branch tip losses aren't going to seriously harm your trees, again, if it's big enough and it's healthy. Now, the cicadas are doing this damage by laying their eggs into branches that have it's kind of an awkward number, unfortunately, but it's a 3/16 of an inch to a 7/16 of an inch in diameter. So remember, that's not circumference, that's diameter. So the distance across the branch in size. And so if you have a smaller tree that you've recently planted that has a lot of either major stems or its trunk falls within that size range, then you might want to think about protecting it, because if it loses those branches or if it loses its trunk, that could be a little bit more of a serious injury. And I will tell you about how to do that in a second. But first, I wanted to talk just briefly about how they're actually doing this damage. It's not from the feeding of the cicadas, it's actually from the egg laying. When cicadas lay their eggs, they use this body part called an ovipositor, which is basically a big, long tube. It's kind of like a sewing needle. You can think of it that way. And they use that to stab into the branch and then kind of inject their eggs into the branch. When they do that, unfortunately, that can split the bark on the tree. And if you get enough of that egg laying on a single tree, it can girdle the twig, and then it can't transport nutrients to its leaves, and then that part of the twig dies. So how can you protect your trees? Well, the good news is the most effective and cheapest option is actually insect netting. And this is true for most people. If you have, say, a large scale orchard, or you did a massive tree planting, then our recommendations are a little bit different, and I can send you a link to that just because of the scale. But if you are a homeowner or you only have a few trees that you want to protect, insect netting is really the way to go. The big thing is just make sure that the holes are smaller than 1/2 inch and that the netting is sturdy enough to last for the month to month and a half that the cicadas are going to be out. For example, some people have asked about whether cheesecloth would work, and I wouldn't recommend cheesecloth just because it kind of can be flimsy, and if you get a tear in it, then the cicadas can get in and lay their eggs, and then what's the point of putting it on to begin with? So I wanted to also address some kind of common questions and concerns that didn't really fit into the cicada biology of things, but these are things that have come up a lot and I wanted to make sure I addressed. So first, are they dangerous? We're getting these massive numbers of insects. Should you be worried about it? Good news is no, they don't bite, they don't sting, they're not poisonous. But, as with any insect that you're interacting with or your pet is interacting with, if you have an encounter with a cicada and you don't feel well afterwards, or if your pet eats a bunch of cicadas and seems to be acting off afterwards, consult a vet or a doctor as appropriate afterwards. Kind of use your best judgment. For example, with pets, I know, my cat will chase any insect that comes indoors and will gobble it up if I don't stop her. And I know plenty of people whose dogs love to eat cicadas and they'll eat a whole bunch of them. That could potentially cause problems for two reasons. So one, even though the cicadas aren't, poisonous, their exoskeletons are made of a material that's really difficult to digest. So your dog might potentially throw up if he eats a lot of cicadas just because there's all this matter that's difficult for him to digest. The second thing is if somebody's treated those cicadas with insecticide or, tried to treat something else and the cicadas get covered in them and then your pet eats a lot of them, or you're, with certain insecticides, even if your pet eats a few, that could make them sick as well. So as I said, we want to reassure people that they're not inherently dangerous while still making sure that people know there are some exceptions, and always consult a vet or a doctor if you're concerned. The other question we get asked a lot is, why every 17 years? Why do they have this crazy long life cycle? Well, the short answer is predators. By only coming out every 17 years in such massive numbers, they're doing two things. One, the large numbers are what's called a predator satiation strategy. And essentially what this means is that the predators can't possibly eat all of the cicadas because there are so many. So some cicadas survive. The cicadas actually that come out on off years, a few of them do get confused. They do get things wrong. Those get gobbled right up. And that's kind of part of what maintains the every 17-year pattern. The second thing is it makes it really difficult for anything to specialize on eating them. A lot of insect populations are kept at fairly low levels, in large part because predators specialize on them and feed on them and keep their populations in check that way. With cicadas, by coming out every 17 years, they largely escape that. Now, I will talk about one exception to that in a minute, but those things combined make it a kind of good strategy for them to wait every 17 years. Here's the exception. You might have heard it referred to as zombie cicadas. And what this is it's a fungus that basically attacks cicadas, replaces their abdomens with fungal spores, and then leads to behavioral changes in the cicada. They produce these chemicals that, one, make the cicadas still stay active, even though they're missing about half their body. And two, it will actually make the male cicadas respond to other males by clicking their wings as though they're females. Those cicadas then come over to mate, they contract the fungus, the whole cycle repeats again. So this is one thing that they haven't escaped. It's a little unnerving. And if you do see what looks like half a cicada wandering around, it's probably had this fungus. Oh, yes, and then it drops down to the soil and lies dormant in the soil until the next cycle. The other question that we get asked a lot is, does this mean there's going to be a lot more cicada killers around? Cicada killers are large wasps that lay their eggs inside cicadas after paralyzing them, bury those in the ground, and then they hatch out and feed on the cicadas underground, which is pretty creepy, I admit. Insects have a lot of predators that do horrendous things to them. So I think people should have a little more sympathy for them. But anyway, we probably will not actually be seeing higher numbers of cicada killers this year because the cicada killers' life cycles are pretty closely lined up to our annual cicadas, which come out at the end of the summer. And so we don't think that they're going to overlap very much at all with the 17-year cicadas. Which brings us to, don't we get these things every year? Why is this such a big deal? Well, we get annual cicadas every year, which is a group of cicada species that are mostly they have a bit more stocky bodies. They're green with a little bit of brown, and they come out in late summer, and you really start noticing them in August. Versus the 17-year cicadas, which have these bright red eyes, kind of golden wings and dark bodies, which come out every 17 years. So they are very different species that do very different things at different times of year. And I kind of like to use the analogy, it's like a cardinal versus a goose. Like they're both birds, but they're doing different things at different times, and they even sound different. We also get the question, is this a plague of locusts? So unfortunately, a lot of people use the word cicadas and locusts interchangeably, and this is particularly common in the Midwest. Good news is, nope, you don't have to worry. They are different insects. Cicadas are closer to plant hoppers, locusts are essentially grasshoppers. They have different mouth parts, so they can't even do the same types of damage to plants. Cicadas have piercing, sucking mouth parts, which means basically they drink everything through a straw. They have like a little straw mouth, stick it into trees, drink the fluid. Grasshoppers and locusts have chewing mouth parts that they use to actually destroy the tissue of the trees and chew it up, and the other plants that they're eating. So they're doing very different types of damage to the plants. And in addition, cicadas, they're only interested in deciduous trees. So those trees you have that lose their leaves in the fall. Occasionally they might get confused and, try and lay their eggs in corn. It's been known to happen, but 99% of the time, they're only going after those deciduous trees. Whereas locusts have a much broader diet and can do a lot more damage that way. Okay, so now the thing that I sort of gave a little bit of a teaser earlier, can you eat them? Yes, you can eat them. You can barbecue them. You can put them in stir fry. Basically, if you can do it with a shrimp, you can probably do it with a cicada. Plus, you can put cicadas in cookies and ice cream and things like that. So there's all sorts of things you can do with them. People have been eating them as far back as we have written or oral records. They are a tasty snack. Few things though. If you have a shellfish allergy, please do not eat cicadas or other insects. You are probably also allergic to them. They're actually closer related than you might think. And so people who have allergies to shellfish usually are allergic to insects. The other thing is, if you are collecting cicadas, you might think, oh, there are all these cicadas on the ground. That's easier to pick up. I'll just gather those up. Don't do that. You don't know how they died. You don't know how long they've been there. If you do want to gather your own cicadas, go for the ones that are alive and look kind of active and healthy. And you can kill them by putting them in your freezer for a while and, until they stop moving. Usually overnight we'll do it. And that's a humane way to kill them as well. Also, try to know the pesticide history of the area you're gathering them from. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but we don't want people accidentally consuming a bunch of pesticides without realizing it and getting sick from that. So just overall, as with anything that you're harvesting from the wild, enjoy it, have a good time with it, but be cautious, err on the side of caution. And if you feel sick, talk to your doctor. Because, I can tell you all about the bugs. I can't tell you about people health. I'm not a people doctor. And lastly, if you are not interested in actually eating a cicada, but want to have some sort of celebration and cicada related and having some food with it, we are actually hosting a cookie contest at Purdue. The cookies do not have to have any kind of insects in them. You just have to decorate them to look like insects. You can draw cicadas on them, any life stage. You can make them shaped like cicadas, anything you want, as long as it's cicada themed, you can enter it. And we've got a bunch of prizes. We have some big posters, we have stickers, we have cookie mixes, all sorts of things. Which brings me to, how do you actually celebrate this? As you can probably tell from my tone of voice this whole time, I am super excited about the cicada emergence. So we have a bunch of resources. First off, there is our cicada website, which the link's there on the screen now. And this has, management recommendations, a little bit of biology about the cicadas. We also have links to other resources, including the cicadas and their lookalikes poster, which you can print out yourself. We also still have the virtual Bug Bowl site up. And on the Bug Bowl site, we had an entire day dedicated to cicadas. So we've got a bunch of videos, things like cicada origami, instructions on there, all sorts of fun ways to have fun with cicadas and this emergence. We're also running two community science programs. One's a little bit more time intensive than the other. You may have heard about this one already, I'm not sure, but I figured I'd mention it again. So the more time intensive one requires monitoring your trees on a regular basis, so every 3 days, and recording when the cicadas emerge. And you can get in touch with me for more details about that. On the instruction sheet, it does say that you have to start before May 1st, but then the weather got cold on us and the cicadas aren't out yet. So as long as the cicadas aren't out in your area, you are definitely encouraged to take part in this if it's something that interests you. The second one, you can kind of do as much or as little as you'd like. For this one, it's a BioBlitz. So we're trying to collect information about not just cicadas, but all the other organisms that are out at the same time. To join this, you just have to join our project on iNaturalist, Indiana Cicada Fest. And then anytime from May 1st to June 1st, pick your favorite spot, go outside, look for any sort of interesting plants, animals, fungi, and hopefully some cicadas. Take a picture, upload it to iNaturalist, and we will be sharing, our results from that, as well as some of our favorite pictures on social media as we go along. So, in summary, if you don't like bugs, don't worry. This is going to be over in about a month and a half, and then you don't have to deal with them for another 17 years. If you do like bugs, or if you're even just a little bit curious, get out there and enjoy it. They are going to be gone in about a month and a half, and you're going to have to wait quite a long time for the next emergence. And with that, I will take any questions.
So I've got a couple questions while people unmute. And that one of the questions was, if the cicada molds its lungs with its exoskeleton, how does it breathe and survive?
Yeah, so it actually, so it's just like kind of the rest of its body. There's new lungs that it gets when it molts. So basically, it's shedding its skin, but it's getting, there's a new version of it right underneath the surface there. So they still have their lungs, don't worry. It's just kind of the outer structure of its lungs. Their insect lungs are more like these long tubes that go into their bodies. You might notice, if you look really closely at insects, sometimes you'll notice these little holes on the outside of their bodies. Those are actually entrances for their lungs, and then there's the tube, and that's how they breathe.
And then what about the size of the mesh, if you want to protect the small tree, or if you have a new tree that you want to put in?
So as long as the mesh it's small enough, it has to be let me just it has to be smaller than 1/2 inch.
What makes it
in order to really keep the cicadas from getting in there. But as long as it's smaller than that, that should be fine. If you're going to the store and looking for something that will work, you want to avoid bird netting, because usually that has much larger holes. But insect netting, if it's labeled specifically for insect netting, that should have holes that are small enough to protect your trees.
All right. Any other questions for people, for Elizabeth?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is Lori Ecker. Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I'm not sure if you saw it. I have a small dogwood I'm planting for a client, and those branches are still pretty small. So is it something, I mean, I guess I could put netting on it, but would it be easier to just hold off until the time has passed?
I think it kind of depends on when you really want to get it in there to really make sure that it's able to kind of establish its root system and everything for the summer. You may, what you could do is, if you haven't planted it yet, you could, if you can wait like a week or two to see if there's going to really be a lot of cicadas in the area.
Okay.
And then if there are a lot of cicadas, you might want to go with that netting. And if there aren't a lot of cicadas, you probably don't have to worry as much. It's really only when there are tons of cicadas out that you should be concerned about those trees.
They're all like a quarter of an inch to like a half an inch. I mean, there's quite a, yeah, they're pretty small limbs.
Yeah.
So they really girdle them. So yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Another question that came up was during the last emergence, a person writes that they had no cicadas. Should they expect the same this time if there's none in their area?
Yeah,
that-
if you didn't have cicadas before, there probably aren't going to be cicadas this time around. Like I said, it takes so long for them to really move into new areas that if you didn't have them in the past, you're not going to have them now. You know, there's the off chance you might get a few, but
Oh, I think she froze for a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. I lost her.
Carrie, could you speak while we wait for Elizabeth to come back? Could you
Freeze?
speak to the fact of, oh, you froze for a minute, Elizabeth.
Sorry about that. I thought it just went silent all of a sudden. It's like, oh no, what did I say?
One of the question is, one person writes they have 170 Japanese maples of various sizes. Can you give an approximate size of what should be protected? Do they prefer Japanese maples over other trees, or?
Hi, that's me.
Nope.
Hi.
My husband, and this is only a half acre property that we have, but he was an amazing horticulturalist by hobby. And his favorite things were Japanese maples, dwarf conifers, and rhododendrons and azaleas. So he planted a lot, and that's what I've counted. And they're of various sizes.
Have you been in the same area since 2004?
30 years.
Do you remember there being a lot of cicadas there last time around, or?
You know, yeah, my brain's not quite that good. I do remember them, but I don't remember how dense they were. But I do know that back then, I don't think we covered anything. So
Yeah,
he
I mean,
was in charge of everything. He was the one who knew what he was doing.
I would say that the trees that have been there for a while, those should certainly be fine unless they're really stressed out and sickly for other reasons. The younger trees, there could be an issue. It depends. I guess it depends how many you have in terms of whether or not you want to put that netting on there, because, you know, it can get cumbersome if you're putting netting on hundreds of trees. But I can also share with you, there's more detailed recommendations, and I will pull that up in a second and put it in the chat, but there's more detailed recommendations about what you can do if you have kind of, you know, acres of trees that you're dealing with, or just a large number of plantings. But I would say if the trees are pretty well established and of decent enough size, that they should be fine. You might lose the tips of the branches, but the trees should be fine.
I see more questions about young trees. Is there a certain circumference that they should be aware of? I mean, when you're thinking of a young tree, I mean.
When are they supposed to get it?
Yeah, here, why don't I can share, because I think I can share this again,
Right.
the screen.
I put the link in there for people to copy the extension for the Purdue Cicada stuff. So that's in the link.
Perfect. Yeah, that will link you to all our management recommendations. You can look at them in detail. We've got a bunch of links at the bottom of that website too, to different articles and different kind of fact sheets that we have that go through all of these different kind of stages of recommendations based on size of your tree, number of trees, things like that. So they're really only interested in laying their eggs on this. Again, I'm sorry for the awkward numbers. We try and be as precise as we possibly can, but the 3/16 to 7/16 of an inch in diameter for those trees.
That's the twig size.
Yes, that's the twig size. And if we're really mainly concerned about if the major branches on the trees or the trunk is that size. If it's just the little twigs at the end, then that shouldn't be an issue. You might lose those twigs, but the tree itself should live on and be okay.
And I take it your netting you get from any garden store?
Yep. Garden stores, big box stores.
Amazon.
Sorry, I missed that.
Oh, Amazon.
Amazon.
Oh, hi. I have used even sort of organza or bridal veil material that you can get from like Joann's Fabrics or places like that. That's what I used to use when I was raising caterpillars outside, and I had those out in the wilds of Colorado all summer long, and the plants were fine and the caterpillars were fine and the material stayed throughout. So you can use something like that as well, although you'll have to kind of compare prices, but there are a lot of options for what you can use. It's just about the size and making sure that it lasts for long enough to protect your trees.
I'm going to ask the Carrie Grable about the education extension educator for Marion County about the questions are being asked about, will this presentation be available? Do you want to answer that, Carrie?
So yes, we're going to work to get this video uploaded in the same place as the others. And I'm sorry, I do not have that link directly in front of me. I wish I did. But we will send out, how about we send out a group email after the presentation so that everybody can get the link to it after I've got that thing posted.
Okay, so Barb can send that out to everybody else just
Sure,
like she did
yeah.
the invitation. to the
We'll get it
meeting.
uploaded and then we'll get it sent out.
Okay, perfect. Any more questions for Elizabeth?
Can you hear me? This is Bruce Pfeffer.
Yes, we can hear you, Bruce.
Do you have anything? Last 17 years ago, I lived in Cincinnati, and Gene Kritsky's research I learned about. So I'm glad you're refreshing my memory and giving me more. Do you have anything to say about their app called Cicada Safari?
Yes.
You didn't mention that, but you mentioned the other ones.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to put that in the presentation. So that's a really great and kind of interesting effort as well. And so basically, if you want something that's cicada specific, Cicada Safari is it's a great app. They have people who are reviewing and checking your photos constantly so that they can kind of quickly confirm whether there are cicadas or not. They're basically trying to create a database that has information about cicada distribution for the entire country. iNaturalist is a more general biodiversity app. And so for our projects, it made a little bit more sense to use that. But I would recommend using either of those depending on your preference. They're both great. They're both great projects. And I really encourage you to help out with either of them. The thing that I hadn't mentioned is one of the reasons we're trying to get so much detailed data about the locations of these cicadas is because that's kind of it's the foundation of a lot of scientific research is distribution of organisms, and really anything from like genetic studies to kind of population studies to management recommendations is based off of where these things are. And since last time they were out, they're only out for a really short amount of time. At the time, we didn't have things like smartphones where we could easily get people going out and checking where they are for us. We only have good data at the county level for the cicadas, but now we can get really precise information and more people have the capacity to, grab their phone and report that way. So we're hoping to get more data through that means.
I put the link for this Cicada Safari on the chat, so you could get a look at it if you want to look into that.
Yeah, great, thank you. And that's a good place to also look for for kind of to keep an eye out for when the cicadas are actually emerging. Every day I wake up and I check that, and I see, okay, have any of them come out yet? And I've seen a few so far. There have been a couple adults that have come out, but it appears that those are just really like the early emergers, and the rest of the cicadas are like, no, it's too cold still. We're not interested in emerging yet, but there've been a couple poking their heads out.
Jean had another question about if you are covering a tree with the netting, does it hurt the tree if you leave the netting on for 4 to 6 weeks?
The tree should be fine. You want to kind of wrap it loosely, but then also tie it at the bottom so that you're not like weighing down the branches and really constricting them, but at the same time, just like think of it as kind of putting a bag over the tree. You want to put it loose, but you also want to have it closed at the bottom so the cicadas can't get in. And also choosing the netting with kind of little small holes in them, or just like if you hold it up and you can see light getting through it, that's important too, because you want your trees to be able to photosynthesize. But as long as the light can kind of get through in a large enough amounts, and as long as you're not really like constricting the trees up tight, they should be okay. And I talk with my hands a lot. Sorry about that.
Great presentation. Any other questions this is your chance to ask about all those different cicada questions you have.
This has been fantastic. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me. And if anyone has questions you think about later, I'm always happy to talk about cicadas, and I'm always happy to answer those questions.
I can kind of tell that you're kind of into cicadas.
Can you put your email in the chat, Elizabeth, so that we could if people want to email with a certain question, would that be available?
Yep, there we go. I just put it in.
I have a question. I understand there are cicada broods in different parts of the country. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what those other ones are?
So I don't know off the top of my head exactly where all of them are, because there are quite a few. But this one is one of the largest broods. It goes all the way from the East Coast into the South a little bit and over into Indiana. And basically the broods, for those of you who don't know, just kind of are assigned based on what year the cicadas are coming out. So each brood is coming out at a different year. And actually, let me see if I can pull up a map.
Are there broods out west?
Not very far out west. This is very much on the east part of the country. Okay, here we go. Share my screen. It's always easier when you have something right in front of you. So you can see here, the yellow is brood 10, which is the one we have right now. And kind of the furthest they're getting is into a little bit of Texas over here as well on the edge here, but they're not getting into like Colorado or any of the further western states. They do go down into the South a bit as well, but the Midwest is kind of the main part of the distribution of these cicadas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So cicadas only range about 50 meters from their site, so they're not really good flyers then, are they?
No, they've got these big wings, so you would think that they would be really good at flying, but they are very heavy and they are very lazy. So they won't travel very far if they can avoid it. 50 meters is like, if you push them and there's no trees for them, they will travel 50 meters, but they really would rather just climb up, stay on the same tree as they've been living on their whole life and just hang out there.
Someone asked a question about posting a link, but I'm not quite sure which link they're asking about.
I shared the link.
It's the link with the broods,
Oh,
the
the
one
broods.
you just showed.
Oh, sure. So this one, you can also find this map with the U.S. Forest Service. I haven't read the rest of this article, so I can't verify that all the information is accurate, but the brood map is from the USDA. So there's the link to that. And actually, now that I'm here, I will share the link to Bug Bowl Cicada Day, which also has the cookie contest information.
Someone wanted the link for the soil temps.
Oh, sure. I can share that. Let's see.
And I think you said it would have to be around 64 degrees warm for them to really come out. That was a question.
Yeah, the soil temperature has to be 64 degrees, and they prefer to come out after a warm rain as well.
What about woody shrubs? Do they need to be protected?
Shrubs are difficult because they do prefer those deciduous trees, so like the larger plants, but they can go after shrubs. Again, I would use the same rule of that side range that I shared before in terms of whether or not you should be protecting your shrubs. But if your shrubs have been there and they're well established, they're decent size, they're kind of they've got lots of branches, they should be okay.
Oh,
I see someone, at least one person worried. Oh, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. But really, I do want to emphasize that most trees, most shrubs are going to be okay, even if it's in some of the denser areas. It's just those ones that are still kind of trying to establish themselves in the soil and are still kind of trying to grow a little bit bigger that we're really worried about.
Okay.
Very nice.
That was cute, Grace.
Well, Elizabeth, we really appreciate you coming and speaking with us today. I think I can speak for everyone in saying that that was an excellent presentation.
Yes, ditto.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to come and share the cicada excitement.
Well, we'll find another topic for you to come speak with us about.
Well, thank
All
you very
right.
much. Anything else? Any other last questions before we end the meeting? Well, thank you again very much, Elizabeth, for the information and the presentation and taking your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
That's awesome.